Hi, everybody. Hola, and welcome back to another edition of the Web of Wyrd podcast with myself, your host, Davyd Farrell, and my co-host, Pete Jackson Main. How you doing, bro?
Hi, Davyd. Great to be here again. I'm doing good. Thank you very much. Got through the solstice and out the other side. All good.
Nice. Can I ask, what did you get up to for solstice? How did you find the energy this year?
Strange. I sort of tried to get myself into some kind of sacred space and I failed. There are a few things going on around me which made that difficult. I did try taking some medicine, as mentioned to you earlier, and what occurred to me was that I sort of woke up at about sort of 3 o'clock in the morning thinking, hang on, where was that? Nothing happened, you know. It was all a bit strange, and it was over very quickly, and the next day I had to go back to work. I had actually given myself about 4 days off this year. I actually called it my solstice recess because my birthday was on day one of that anyway, and I thought I never work on my birthday, so that was kind of sacrosanct. But it was just really strange how the attempt to kind of get into that space didn't really work, and I had all sorts of things knocking on the inside of my head that were like, you know, no, you got to do this, you've got to put this in place, you really got to sort that one out. And so I ended up being kind of quite me rearranging various components of my life and getting them set up for the next stretch of time, I guess. But it wasn't a big sort of massive realization of any kind, which I had sort of been expecting and hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you're saying all of that because that was kind of my experience too. And
Really?
you know, yeah, the last few solstices, the summer particularly, because I really resonate with the energy that comes at solstice. It's very solar, very yang, very connected to the archangelic realms. And then winter solstice, I find to be much more yin, inwards kind of experience. And the previous few solstices for me, all of them have been super powerful. And normally, a bit like yourself, I would be with certain medicines, you know, that we talk about on this show sometimes. And this year I didn't actually work particularly with that medicine, but I did work with other medicines. But like you, I didn't really experience a great deal. There were no big downloads. There was no big information. But what I did get was a very strong sense of like calling in the yang energy to set up what is about to happen in my life next. So that's kind of interesting. But I also found the energy of the day itself, to, at least for me, to be a little on the how to say, the depressed side. It felt a bit like a smothering had occurred somewhere in the ethers that kind of just knocked down the yang energy a little bit. So I don't know what to make of all of that, but that was my experience. And having spoke to other people back in Britain, many people said it was super powerful and very energizing. So I find it interesting.
That is interesting. I've not spoken to anybody in the UK who said that, interestingly enough. My impression in the people in the UK at the moment is they're all, to some extent, under the influence of this kind of what I call a toxic soup that we were talking about earlier. A lot of people becoming very aware of the amount of heavy metals in their systems, in the air, in the atmosphere, in the ground, everywhere. And I think that's something we're going to be talking about later on. But then, of course, there's the soup that we all live in. That's been strange because I've almost felt at times that that's been visible. What I'm talking about is the electromagnetic soup that's kind of, I think, got even more dense since 5G came along. And sometimes I get the impression that that is almost becoming, it's almost like showing itself physically. I can't quite explain it, but it's almost like I'm being shown at various opportunities that actually this is really, as I just move through space, I am moving through this stuff and it's having an effect. Now I feel I'm pretty, I'm pretty strongly protected because of certain measures that I take. But for people who aren't, I think they're becoming very, very much destabilized by it. By and large, I know people fairly close to me who I think are just not really themselves at the moment.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would agree with that. Here in Mexico, the energy is different, particularly the part of Mexico that I live in. It's very clean and clear, and I live in the mountains, so the energy is good. I'm also living at 2,300 meters, so I'm living at some level of altitude, and the wider effects of the aforementioned offered medications has not been strong here. But I definitely, in the last week or so, have been slimed, however I want to say it, by some big heavy metal dose that came from somewhere. And I believe it was due to being very in close proximity to somebody who was just receiving the aforementioned offered medication. And actually, our president here in Mexico, AMLO, he goes by the name of, actually banned the use of the offered medications to under 18-year-olds, to minors. So there's been a big shift here in the emphasis. But the reason I just want to draw attention to that is that for the first time in this process, I experienced very, very intense body pains that I had to do a lot of clearing work to remove. Now, some people might believe that if they received those symptoms, that they might have caught some aspect of one of the so-called viruses that are flying around out there. For me, it was a very energetic experience, and I experienced it energetically. It felt a bit like I'd kind of had a certain part of my body just dunked into a chemical bath, which then sort of manifested more into my higher mind awareness, which is where I started doing the work and managed to remove most of the unhelpful energy. But having suffered with, at various points in my life, activated Epstein-Barr virus, and not having had that for a year, suddenly all of the symptoms of that have come on. A lot of pain in my legs, a lot of pain in my knees. In fact, a lot of pain in places where I've often had long-term injuries. So I find that super interesting too. And having canvassed a few friends and colleagues over the last week, I realized that I'm not the only person who's actually experienced that in the last week, and actually quite often in the same parts of the body. So the effects of the soup, I think, are very, very real. And like you, bro, I can often actually see it. But for the first time really in this whole process, I got slammed by it this week, and I've had to do a lot of clearing work to remove it. And I'm still dealing with that. I'm having to kind of do a lot of detoxing at the moment. So yes, we're going to talk about heavy metals at the end of the piece, because I think it's really important.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, my practice is based on detoxification, has been for a long, long time. Probably before I even got into herbs, I was doing detoxing with herbs, but before I actually started learning about herbs as in a herbalist capacity, so to speak, I was using herbs to remove things that I didn't need from my body, whether they be metabolic waste products that are routinely produced in ordinary metabolic activity, or whether they be things that I'd somehow taken on from the environment. And I've worked with that for a long time, and I think one of the things that distinguishes my style of herbal medicine, but also my teaching, and because I'm the course leader for the college, I also put a lot of this out to our students as well, who are beginning to realize now that this is really worthwhile stuff. That if you do the detoxing, all of the other healing kind of comes on the back of that. And I think that's really, really important, because there are herbalists, and I'm not sort of going to get involved in dissing anybody off or criticizing anybody, but there are herbalists who will simply regard herbs as medicines in pretty much or very similar way to allopathic medicines, and we don't use them like that. Frequently what we're looking at is clearing encumbrances. And so this idea of detox has been with me personally for over 40 years, really, since I first started working those particular programs on myself. So when it comes to heavy metals, I think your own assessment of that is directly relevant here, and that is that the viruses, whatever a virus is, and I don't think in the scientific world they begin to approach an understanding of viruses, but the viruses are actually there to help us. I believe they are bits of DNA, they're bits of information that we need. I think you use the term magic. They're magic. They are magic. They're a form of magic, like everything else. They are, they are connected through the various dimensions or levels or densities of experience. They have an energetic reality as well as a physical reality. It's actually very difficult to prove they have a physical reality. I know people who just point blank say they don't exist, but something is there. But whether we frame it as we do, because we have this thing in our understanding of the difference between terrain theory and germ theory. So what matters to us is that that we ourselves are clear, and then whatever we call germs are not going to be active within us. So the viruses, as you in the way that you explained it, they wake up and remind you that you're actually now running into danger because you've taken on too much of this stuff and you need to clear it out. And my experience working with people, and I've worked with people with post-viral fatigue syndrome, which basically is what long COVID is. And that kind of, again, it gives credence to the idea that the virus was responsible for it. Although I always explain to people it's not the virus, it's actually the state of you that we're concerned with. But also something else that's very, very big in this part of the world, and I don't know whether it is where you are, is Lyme disease. Well, of course, you know people who are affected by Lyme. I've never had a Lyme case yet that didn't respond to a proper detox. You have to do it quite carefully with them because you can go into die-off, Herxheimer reactions and things, but it really does work. And there are people out there working with antibiotics because they say Lyme is so difficult and dangerous that you have to literally, napalm it to get rid of it. And my experience is very, very different from that. So yeah, this idea of, pain in the body and symptoms in the body being warning signs that you need to detox. I think I take that very, very seriously.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those things, bro. I mean, we kind of launched into this part of the topic for today quite heavily, so we'll just go with it. But I mean, yeah, my kind of remit, from what I understand, from journeying to meet the spirit of Epstein-Barr virus, as I've talked about before, I think on previous podcasts, and also being able to look at what's going on in my 3D and 4D self from a 5D perspective has really helped me strip out lots of things and see them for what I believe they are, really. And so, yeah, so in this particular case, the Epstein-Barr virus got activated in me, giving me the body pains, which I had for a long time, up until doing a detox last year, actually, and I hadn't suffered since. Suddenly got activated big time. So I decided, I kind of had a little bit of a Scorpio moment, went through lots of disaster scenarios as to what was going on in my body, and went through all of the really dark spaces first, and then thought, hold on a second, this isn't correct. I need to go to a 5D perspective and look into what's going on here. And so what I realized was that I'd encountered, and I believe it was from being in close proximity to somebody who'd literally just taken the injection, I got hit with what some people might call the shedding. I would describe it differently, maybe that's a conversation for a different day, but I got hit with the energy of a lot of very, very toxic chemicals and heavy metal, which then went into my body, immediately started causing a reaction. Took me a few days to work out, because there was a whole bunch of things going on at the same time. But it was only when I went to my 5D perspective and started analyzing from there, with the help of some of my plant medicines, I was able to see that there was actually the effects of an energetic consciousness that had come into my body that was then also trying to convince me that I actually had the aforementioned virus, which of course I didn't believe, because I'm like, no, this is an energy and I can remove it, which I did. However, at the same time, because the dosing was so heavy, my physical body somehow has got activated. So again, I have to do the detoxing. And I've been doing that for the last week. And compared to how I felt a week ago, where I was in absolute agony, like my knees were on fire, I felt like someone had set fire to the veins in my leg. It was absolutely excruciating. All of that's gone. And so I'm now just in the process of really just deactivating the heavy metals in my body to go back below the sort of the 10% level where EBV, the spirit of EBV, goes to sleep. So I completely concur with you that really I see viruses as part of our innate magical defense system, that are inside our bodies. I know there are theories out there about manipulated viruses in a laboratory. I am not really sure how that would work. we'd have to have our immune system isolated somehow, which I think is completely personal to everybody, and then put into a laboratory. I'm more of the opinion that what's coming out of the laboratories is what we might call a type of unhelpful energetic intelligence, or we might call it magic in some circles. So these are just ideas and theories, but certainly in my experience, when my Epstein-Barr virus kicks in, it's to tell me that I've just received a massive dose of something, normally of a heavy metal nature, that is not helpful to my physical body.
Yeah, it occurred to me as you were talking there that I think we mentioned it earlier when we were chatting before coming on here, that the physical body is always going to be a reflection of the psychic body, and that's where disease actually starts. So everything is psychological, and viruses are no exception to that. Then you've got to figure out what the various players in the psychological drama are, and
Yeah.
what effects they're there to do, and what, are they helpful, are they not helpful? And by far, most of the time, I think that they are helpful, but we frame them in a way that's very negative. So this came to me, for example, when I think we did a couple of shows back when we did, and I just had COVID back in February, and I said, yeah, it was great. It felt like an upgrade, man. It was very, very interesting. I kind of welcomed it in a way, because I was aware, actually, also, because it's a painful experience. I mean, it is painful. The pain visits the weak points too. So the bits of me that hurt usually hurt even more when I was doing that. But I was also aware of a kind of energy going in there that was drawing my consciousness and my awareness. Because the other thing I think very much is the case is that if you are not conscious of any particular area in your body, that in a sense is where something can get in that might hurt you as well. So the answer for me is always to try and say, how can I actually insert my consciousness? Because to me, who I am at a higher mind level is always going to determine the state that my body is in. So if my body's not in a good state, then I'm thinking somewhere up there in the higher mind state, there's something I'm not looking at. And I see it as vitality and energy. I come from a vitalistic tradition in terms of herbal medicine and natural healing, I call it, where it's the failure to or the blocking off of vitality from certain areas of the body, which is responsible for the fact that things develop in unhelpful ways, in painful ways, in chronic ways. And I've always found that when I've gone into the pain, particularly, this is maybe going a little bit further away from our chosen topics today, but I think it's important that when I've actually gone into the pain rather than tried to block it off, that also has been an experience of allowing the healing in as well. And I kind of, I've done a lot of bodywork therapy as well. I don't know whether I ever told you that, but I used to be, I was trained in something called polarity therapy, is another theme that perhaps we're going to be talking about a bit later. But polarity in the sense of the essential physical polarity of the body, head north and feet south, and all sorts of other correlations that we can put in there. And what we find in that work is that where we find locations where there is pain, we actually deliberately work into them, not in a way that causes real distress, but just to bring the awareness of that person into that painful area, so that the whatever stuck there can be liberated and cleared through. And it's the vitality and the energy itself that does the clearing. We don't do the clearing. I'm not pushing energy in any way at people. I'm just really there to bring the attention to the places that are perhaps lacking in vitality and in consciousness.
Wow, that's so interesting. And as you're saying that, it's just again reminding me of what I know that we both believe, which is really that the body is showing us where the emotional traumas are. And so when we've got something coming up in the body, if we have the nous and the sense to go, oh, okay, so this is like a pain here or it's a pain here, what does that actually correlate to? We can start to use our body as the radar to tell us where the emotional traumas are that we need to look at, because the body is always the final resting place. It's the sort of the final destination. And so whether that's knee pain, whether it's back pain, whether it's some kind of potential cancer issue, organ issue, whatever, all of these, in my belief, and I haven't seen anything to refute this in my work yet, they are all the result of an emotional disturbance that is happening in the fourth dimensional human emotional realm. And so if we're able to go to that 5D perspective, we can start to observe ourselves in the emotional realm, seeing what's going on, and then going, there's the correlation to why is that coming up in my body. So rather than doing like Western medicine does, which really kind of concentrates on 3D, which is really going around in circles, if we go to our 4D emotional body and can analyze ourselves, or maybe have a friend or a healer or someone to help us to point the direction, we can then see the real place where the healing work has to be done at the emotional level. Once that's been unlocked, or even just brought into the conscious awareness, that's a big piece of the healing already going on there, is to realize that the pain in the body is being caused by an emotional disturbance. Once that's brought up, then it's kind of more into the light and more illuminated, and it's come out of the shadows. And a bit like you with the body working, I kind of see the same analogy. It's like, if we can just take ourselves a little bit into the painful place, we can start to bring the deeper pain to the surface for release, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, really resonating with that. Very, very much. The other thing, though, is that, it is to bring belief into it a little bit as well, because I think
Yes.
there, you know, when it comes to certain pathologies, and you mentioned cancer, and there are a few others that have this kind of real kind of heavy wall that may not be penetrated, and it's partly, I think, set up by vested interests who make a lot of money dealing with things like that. I mean, if you talk about cancer, you can't really talk about cancer without noting that natural cures, in inverted commas, or treatments or alleviations for cancer are frequently under attack from the status quo, simply because they don't want to give anybody else the power. They don't want anybody else to have the power to heal at that level, because they're making a lot of money out of it. It's a big, big industry. And they're also protecting their professional territory with it as well. You know, you can't treat cancer because you're not trained in a particular way. And we all know there are many, many things that work for that. And I've got something which you asked me to bring forward about our friend Horsetail in that regard. You know, maybe a little bit later. But it occurs to me that I was trained in a school where they said one of the first things I ever heard was there is no such thing as an incurable disease. I think if you've had, as you said earlier, if you've had bits removed, or if you were born without something, you're not going to grow a limb that was never there. I'm not going to grow my appendix back, probably, although people have grown tonsils back and things like that sometimes. But what we mean by that is when a doctor says, and I was told, for example, oh yeah, you know, you've got extensive osteoarthritis of the hip, you will need a hip replacement, you won't be able to walk without a hip replacement. Well, I proved that wrong. You know, 5 years ago, I couldn't really walk and I was having real problem. But now, I mean, I spent yesterday walking around the Cambridge University Botanic Garden, doing a little bit of filming in there with all the plants. And by the end of the day, it was aching for sure, but I couldn't have done that 4 or 5 years ago. I know that what I'm doing is working. And it comes from never accepting that idea of incurability. And it was the herbalist, Dr. Christopher, who actually, he was citing Avicenna, the Persian physician that presumably a lot of people will have heard of, who said there's no such thing as an incurable disease, only the want of knowledge. And Dr. Christopher changed it very subtly and very cleverly. He said there's no such thing as an incurable disease, but there are incurable people. And I thought that was quite nice, because that gives the onus of healing on the person to be healed. In other words, you know, if you believe that you're not going to be cured, then you won't be cured.
Right. I mean, this is the limiting belief systems. And just to kind of share a little story from a recent experience of my own, it was, I mean, I haven't really had to go to the British healthcare system since I was, a teenager. For a variety of reasons, but I have had to have several operations on my left knee due to a snapped meniscus from a football injury. And the most recent of these was literally it was in 2019. And to cut a long story short, the surgeon who was doing the work, here's the crazy thing, I had to pay a little bit of extra money to see the surgeon privately to speed up the process, because the NHS was so slow in appointments. But it was the same guy, whether I paid him privately or not, it was going to be the same guy, because he was the guy working for the NHS and he's the only surgeon in the whole of Mid Wales. So anyway, I was just like, I literally had to pay a couple £100 to jump up the queue to see the same guy that I would have seen anyway if I'd done on the NHS, who was going to be the same guy for the operation. Yeah. Anyway, from day one of the, that I had the consultation with this chap, it became very apparent to me that he was really doing a lot to cover his ass in case the operation didn't go that well. And literally the last thing he said to me before I went under the anaesthetic in Clandrindod Wells, when I had the day operation, was like, well, Mr. Farrell, of course you're not 21 anymore, and so the knee's not ever going to be the same way that it once was. And that was literally the last thing he said to me before I was due to have the anaesthetic. Now, thankfully, I had already foreseen this kind of energetic attitude. And so I'd done a lot of preparation work, and I wasn't accepting that spell or that narrative, because I'm like, I don't believe that, man. My knee is going to be great again. And actually, it's been great since the operation. And I'm just like, wow, what a thing to say to somebody as the very last input they have before they go under the anaesthetic. Well, it's not going to be like it once was. Wow. Why not? Why can't it be? actually.
Yeah, good question, bro.
Yeah,
Good question.
why can't
Yeah,
it be? And it's just like, I don't really appreciate you spelling me before I go to sleep.
yeah.
You know, it's like, so
It's
I'm
like,
just putting it out there because I've heard lots of similar stories that create these limiting belief systems from our healthcare system that basically are telling you it's not going to be as good as it once was. It's not going to get better. You're going to be on medication. Warfarin is a good one, you know, that people often get hooked onto for the rest of your life. And it's like it's not true, actually, I don't think.
no, it's not. Objectively, it's not true. Unfortunately, many people are out there making it true,
Mm-hmm.
unconsciously or consciously, either because they refuse to believe anything else, or because they are so enchanted, they have been spelled into believing that and not querying it or questioning it. The other thing that comes into this sometimes is that the answers are actually there, but we're not reading them. I'll give you an example. When I was doing the research on stem cells in the hip, by the way, stem cells are really interesting because, you know, they can pretty much turn into anything, so that you can use them to cure. And I could pay 15,000 quid and have stem cell therapy on my left hip, and it would sort of sort it out like instantly, apparently, or very, very quickly at any rate. And I'm not going to do it because I said to myself, well, if that's possible, and I've got stem cells anywhere in my body, I can just tell them where to go, where they're needed. Surely I can just do
Nice.
that.
Yeah.
And I was reading this paper, and it was really negative, because it was saying, oh, well, you know, trouble with hip arthritis is that you've got loads and loads of stem cells in your ankle. So if you bugger that up, you're fine. You've got less, but still quite a good number in your knee. So you're pretty okay for that, unless you really go chronic, and then you might have a knee replacement. Unfortunately, in the hip, there aren't that many. And most people go, oh, right, okay, so that's why my hip's not going to get better. But I said, hang on a minute, you said there are not that many, but that means there are some, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if there are some, we can build on that. That's something we can build on. And that is what I ran with, that because there's been some research that was done that they're not going to say that it regenerates cartilage, but what they're saying is it protects what's there. But what I've found, and this is particular therapies that I've had, which come under physiotherapy and osteopathy, actually. But what I've found since engaging in those therapies is that I would say definitely, without a shadow of a doubt, the situation in my hip is improving exponentially over what it was. So I think, you know, that's on the purely physical level. I've been doing all the sort of mind stuff as well, but the physical level, even at the physical level, the messages that are put out by the mainstream are wrong, and they are misleading people, and they're damaging people, actually.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think what's really important there is the positive attitude aspect of this, which is looking for a positive outcome and solution rather than accepting a much more dreary negative one that's being offered perhaps by somebody else. And yeah, you nailed it. It's like, yeah, there might not be many, but there's still something I can work with. And I think that's the kind of that's the attitude of health, right?
Yeah.
That we're looking for in our bodies, and also that kind of self-responsibility. Hey, if I've got these stem cells, I can do it myself, right? And I think this is all really, really important as we shift into a more quantum understanding about the technology that is our higher mind, but our higher mind in connection with our spacesuit, you know, the meat bag, as my teacher would call it, the 3D body. And I think all of these ideas that we're sharing right now are a large piece of a new type of self-awareness that is coming in. And in fact, I'm going to be, as you know, doing a session with the Ascended Master Zachariah this week, talking about quantum plant healing and healthcare and medicine as part of the whole sort of piece of the new earth and Uranus and Taurus and you know, the astrology that supports all of this. So that's going to be coming up on the 29th, and there'll be details in the show notes, but we're going to be talking about these things because I think they're really important, that we actually have within us the capacity to heal pretty much anything, with the understanding that we can. But if we're constantly being told that things can't be fixed and that's just how it is, then we just take that on board. And I've been told already about things that couldn't be fixed in my body that I had to come to Mexico to get fixed. And if I hadn't got them fixed here, I probably would have had some big issues with some of the the levels of toxicity that are now in our environment coming from certain types of medications that are out there. And I think, you know, really, you know, the reason we perhaps started on this note is because we're both concerned about the levels of toxicity that we're observing serving as healers and herbalists in our environments, particularly in the UK, and then also that being reflected back from some of our clients that we're speaking to, and their sort of levels of desperation. Even if they've been detoxing for a while, they're absorbing so much toxicity from their environment and perhaps people around them that it's a bit like, you know, the sort of proverbial ladling the water out of a sinking boat. You're kind of doing it as quickly as you can, but it's coming in quicker than you can get it out. So I just want to share that. You know, we're going to perhaps move on to some of the news of this week, because there's a few pieces we want to cover, but then we're going to look back to again bring some of these threads that we've just brought in here on the health and plants into our kind of plant analysis this week. So lots of juice, bro. It's been quite a juicy week on the energy levels. It's been a bit yucky, I think. You know, looping back to the solstice again, I found the energy to be more challenging this last week, and it certainly wasn't helped by getting so badly toxified from something. But you know, we live in a toxic world, and you know, perhaps this is a nice segue into bringing some of the toxic news that we've got this week that we just would like to assess between ourselves and our audience. And the first one that's caught my attention is the piece on Rwanda. Which for those of our audience who are perhaps not so UK centric or UK based, our esteemed politicians led by Mr. Johnson, we're not going to refer to him anymore as Boris, as some of our some of our listeners rather, have suggested that perhaps Boris is too nice a name for this chap, and perhaps our Mascot of Mayhem is a much more apt title. So along with other ministers, I think including Priti Patel, they've decided that for some reason that we can ship certain types of humans, otherwise known as refugees, to Rwanda, because it's a good place for them, apparently, because Rwanda has a great human rights track record, and so on and so forth. Now, coincidentally, it turns out that it also, in the same time frame that all of this has happened, that there was also the biannual Commonwealth meeting, or sort of meeting of the Commonwealth countries, of which Prince Charles was attending, and which Mr. Johnson has also been out attending this week, in the middle of a week when he lost two very important by-elections. So the question is, like, you know, how is the government, our government, deciding which refugees are worthy of being sent to Rwanda and which ones are actually able to stay in the UK? And it seems that apparently, if you're of a more Middle Eastern persuasion, Rwanda is your next destination. But if you're of Ukrainian persuasion, apparently you can stay in the UK. Who's deciding this is very much an open question. But the other piece I want to throw in, which kind of really caught me this week, was a nice picture of a bunch of people breaking ground for a new COVID vaccination test center where mRNA will be tested and produced. So I just want to bring all of those pieces into one big happy picture, because of course Rwanda is a country that has a very happy recent past, right? So I'm wondering whose bright idea was all of this and why.
Yeah, there's a lot there, bro. I mean, I think I've just been watching with horror as the Rwanda thing unfolds, because first of all, I think we did mention it on our last Web of Wyrd that this was happening, and that at that time we were expecting the European Court of Human Rights to intervene, which it did.
It did, yeah.
The flights were stopped, and they still haven't been restarted. So the government is now frantically trying to appeal against the ECHR ruling, and as we're doing that, as you say, Mr. Johnson rocks up in Rwanda for the Commonwealth meeting, and at the same time we get the news that that Pfizer BioNTech are building a facility out there, and you just got to marvel at the coincidence or not. I'm putting that word in inverted commas. There's got to be a connection, hasn't there? I mean, are they shipping immigrants out, refugees out, to be some kind of experimental fodder for this new facility? What is happening? What's in their heads? Because if that comes out, I don't hold much hope for their appeal. Not that I hope for their appeal at all, really. I hope it's overturned and big time. I think it's an absolutely appalling policy in the first place. It's an appalling thing to even think of doing to people, especially with the reputation that Rwanda has.
Right. I mean, I'm just throwing this out for our listeners to ponder on themselves, because it's a strange set of coincidences, as we would say. And even Prince Charles himself has come out supposedly and denounced the plan, which apparently a deal was cooked up. And I don't have the exact figures to hand, but with the current incumbent premier of Rwanda, who was in fact the guy that led, I think, the insurgency that overthrew the previous regime. So there was a little bit of bloodshed there. But apparently some deal was agreed to the tunes, I think, of some several hundreds of millions of pounds for Rwanda to take these people off our hands. So I'm wondering whether this is just another one of these kind of pieces where we're being encouraged to see what is being pointed at by this story. And I would perhaps suggest that this is pointing to Britain's recent past in treating people a certain way, depending on their national status or which part of the world they're from. And of course, this isn't a recent phenomenon for Britain with its colonial history. This goes back several hundred years. So I'm wondering whether we're just being encouraged to look again at like whether Britain really has given up its deplorable human rights record. I know we like to think of ourselves as being some of the world leaders, but actually, if we look at recent history or past history, our track record is not that great, actually. And perhaps that's what we're being encouraged to think about, is that how much longer we're going to tolerate our government treating people like this, because clearly it's not very, it's not very nice, is it, Pete?
It's brutal. And I mean, and it comes not exactly hard on the heels, but certainly within memory, living memory, as we might say, bearing in mind that people's attention spans can be a little short these days. But Windrush,
right, yeah, there we go.
proves what they are capable of doing. And it is, I'm afraid, I mean, I don't know what the other lot, the so-called opposition, what view they would take of this, but it is a Tory story, this one, yes, through and through. And Priti Patel is, unthinkably a Tory, given her own situation and the fact that she is basically also an immigrant. I do not understand how these people can justify their policies at all. They seem to be operating out of a sense of complete entitlement, immunity, and the lack of any kind of humanity, it seems to me.
Right, and in response to all of this, because this is in all of the major newspapers, we're recounting stories here that were in the Independent Apple News this week, so we're not in any kind of rabbit hole territory here. But in response to all of this, our Mascot of Mayhem has again reiterated the fact that he doesn't believe that people really want to be bogged down with what's going on with him in his personal situations in the political world. He believes that the people of Britain are much more interested in how we're going to make the country great again. I would perhaps suggest, without having a lying, corrupt prime minister, might help that situation.
That might help, yeah.
So again, I'm wondering at what point does Mr. Teflon actually either do the decent thing and step down, or is removed, because everything is indicating that perhaps he's not really the right guy for the job. And according to the news reports today, the only thing that might make him consider actually stepping down of his own volition, and he wouldn't be pinned on this either in true Mr. Johnson style, but he did suggest that maybe if we've got things wrong in the Ukraine and that if we have to withdraw from supporting that situation, that he might find that a bit too much of a bitter pill to swallow and a bit too much of a defeat for him personally, and he might step down. So make of that what you will, because then you also have to factor in the whole piece about what's really going on in the Ukraine, which is probably a show for another day. But
I've had the impression with Mr. Johnson that he seems to be sort of ever more frenetic. I mean, he was pretty frenetic at the best of times, but it's almost like he's trying to cram as much in before he has to go, because he does have to go, as he possibly can. I was just, Rwanda, you must be joking. Why? But you're right about pointing to something. I mean, pointing to the British Commonwealth, for example, right, which is the vestige of the empire, really, and asking us to really, I mean, I've never really, I was, brought up as English, as indeed, I guess you were, to kind of be proud of our heritage. But when I started to learn about the British Empire, I was absolutely horrified. And my idea of being English or British or any of those things, to the extent that I even care, it has nothing to do with any of that whatsoever. I think it, when they threw that that slave trader, that statue of that slave trader into the river in Bristol, I thought that's the kind of country I want to live in. And yet, if you do that sort of thing now, I mean, I think they prosecuted that guy, didn't they? It was just, it just boggles my imagination. People are in this country, and I don't speak to many people. I don't know what it is. I've protected myself maybe by only knowing really good people, but I don't know anybody who really thinks any differently from this. But I think we don't want this to be associated with this stuff anymore. We don't want to be associated with, shipping people off to Rwanda in aircraft for no greater crime than being refugees. I don't think we want that, and I have to say, big up Prince Charles, because and people came down on him really heavily. They were saying, you shouldn't get involved in politics, you're going to be king one day soon, and we don't want a king who interferes. Actually, come on, if you're saying the right things, I want a king who interferes.
Yeah, I do too. I want somebody who's going to stand up for what's right.
Yeah.
I mean, all of this is making me think actually about the infamous East India Company, which very cleverly ingratiated and integrated itself into basically British governmental society in the sort of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And really, along with the Dutch East India Company and also probably the Hudson Bay Company in Canada, really were some of the main protagonists for all kinds of horrible atrocities committed to humans, all in the great name of the British Empire or the other colonizers of the time. And it's kind of interesting to think about these corporations, because the East India Company was a corporation that somehow then somewhat became a part of the British establishment. And it's just this is by way of a segue into the next piece I want to do. Yeah. It made me think about the court case that Mr. Trump is now taking against the corporation known as the United States of America. Now, maybe you're not aware of this, but Mr. Trump is actually taking the US, the corporation, the United States of America, to court. And involved in all of that are the Clintons and a bunch of other interesting people who've been a big part of the process. So, it's an interesting idea that perhaps that a nation is actually a corporation or has become subverted to that place. What do you think about that, Pete?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is the crux of the whole thing, isn't it? And I'm really, really heartened to hear that. I didn't know. I kind of knew that it was on the cards that he would do that. I didn't know it was actually going ahead. That's beautiful, because the fact that nations are corporations is the root of all our problem. In a certain, it's the straw man, isn't it? Because they become corporations, they own us. We are their assets, except that we're not really in reality, of course. And it's that dismantling of the idea of the state as a corporation that I think is central to proper political freedom and sovereignty for human beings on this planet. And it reaches into all areas of life. I'm not going to be go for too much disclosure here, but where it comes to tax, for example, I do actually feel that tax is illegal and criminal. And if it were, as it is sort of supposed to be, a cooperative way of pooling money so that we can get what we want and have roads and hospitals and whatever, even though those things themselves are bastions of the corporation as well. But if it were about helping each other, then it would be one thing. But it's a strange fact that something a little less than 40% of the tax that we pay in the UK actually pays for things that we need. Where does the other 60% go? I've often asked this question. Nobody seems to know.
Apparently, it's going to Rwanda to build
yes.
centers for whatever. It's probably also going to pumping as many weapons as we can into the Ukraine, apparently. So in a cooperative, all of these things I wouldn't mind paying money for. If we need a new road, I'm happy to put my hand in my pocket if we're doing it as a community. And I think that this is perhaps more where we should be moving to, rather than giving or being forced to give money to people like Mr. Johnson and Miss Patel to spend at their own discretion. At least we not
Absolutely.
forget all of the PPE equipment that vast
Oh God.
quantities of money was spent on,
Yeah.
and of course the incredibly incredible piece of technology that was the track and trace app that cost some 240 billion pounds apparently to never work properly. So I would say that's probably where that 60% is going, bro.
Yeah, I totally. And sort of paying people who don't own shipping companies to run shipping companies to help us out of the mess of Brexit. That was another little, stunning little piece of sleight of hand there that they got away with. They get away with it. This is the thing. I mean, we're the stupid ones. How do we
Yeah.
not stop them?
Well, we just don't pay the tax, and we all do it en masse, and then they don't have any
yeah.
money. So there's many ways we can do this, but we have to act as one. And this is how the Britain has managed to conquer the world, because it's very good at divide and conquer. And it's we sort of have the impression that it was done to other people overseas during the height of the Victorian era, but actually, if we look carefully, we can still see that's been very much going on over the last 2 years, and in fact generally been going on forever in Britain, even to the extent that the island is divided into 4 nations, all with some still slightly antagonistic feelings towards particularly Westminster. So it's just like, even at home in Britain, the empire was divided, I think consciously. So anyway, this is kind of, and again, the piece about Trump was just to lead into what's going on in the US this week, was obviously 2 major decisions within the Supreme Court. And we covered the Roe versus Wade one on the previous edition. And of course, that's now been overturned. But I would like to say, rather than getting too much into that, the real piece here is about polarization. And in my recent discussion with the Ascended Master Zachariah, he pointed out to me, he said, just remember that polarization and duality are not the same thing. So I just wondered if you've got anything you want to say around that, Pete.
I'd like to hear a bit. I'd like to hear a bit more from you and Zach on that one, actually, because I'm intrigued. I'm trying to sort the threads of it. You mentioned it to me earlier, and I think I kind of understood what you were saying about it. And in terms of the way that you can see people being polarized by, it's been happening in the UK for a long time. It's almost built into British politics, polarization. It certainly happened over Brexit, and then it happened over the pandemic as well. So yeah, I mean, give me some background. What's behind that?
Well, I mean, so if I sort of think about these 2 ideas of sort of dualism and polarization, I mean, we live in a dualistic world, right? So, we have this idea of light and dark and day and night and good and bad. And that's part of the construct that is the Earth, right? Or the planet that we currently live on in this quadrant of the universe, as I think Zachariah put it. Not every part of the universe operates in the same way. But in this part of the universe, duality and linear time are a part of the construct. So that's okay. We can be non-dual beings having a dualistic experience, so that we can understand many things and evolve and grow. However, polarization is a deliberate division that creates antagonistic, mostly energetic outputs that then can be utilized or manipulated because of the emotional charge behind them.
Okay, that makes sense of it. Absolutely, yeah. I like the idea of being a non-dual being having a dualistic experience. I kind of I'm comfortable with that.
I thought you might.
Polarity, yeah, you're right, and you can see from that perspective that polarity is a very different thing. And yeah, it's politically motivated, it's motivated by vested interests, it's motivated by the same thing we were talking about just a minute ago, states being corporations, everything being corporations basically, and us being somehow owned by those people. And polarization is clearly a way to herd us as cattle into certain directions where we're needed, into the pen that we're needed at any particular moment in order to deliver their best interests. That's what I see it as anyway. I think people are polarized in this country over Brexit, for example. I don't even yet know what that was for. In bigger terms, I can have a few guesses about it, but when I actually look at it, it's still a huge mess. But I'm sure there's a plan behind it at some stage as well. So I think you're right with polarization. You said polarity, but I'd probably say polarization. There's always, shall we say, a mundane agenda rather than anything metaphysical. perhaps.
Right. And so, in the US this week, we've had these two big decisions around the right to abort or the right to openly carry firearms. And I can see that it doesn't really matter which way the decisions went, there's always going to be massive polarization. And of course, any of the astrologers out there in our audience listening will know about the whole, Pluto return for the US. And so here's an interesting piece also that I've been contemplating, is that the US only has a recent history of 300 years, really. Before that, it was a much more kind of a tribal confederacy with the First Nations people, which I think I understand was much more harmonious than the last 300 years. So this then made me think about what's going on in Europe. And at this point in time, at the end of an epoch, there is an unwinding of karma that is going on for all of us on an individual level, for sure. I've definitely experienced it, and I'm sure many of our audience can too, if they think about what they've been going through. But also at the collective level, there is a national unwinding of karma. And so, the US is going through a very obvious one with its astrology right now. And of course, we can see that with the astrology of this week, with Mars conjuncting Eris in Aries tomorrow, that's very much about, Mars is the warrior. Eris is also a chaotic warrior. And, so that energy is kicking off there tomorrow. We then move into Neptune going retro in Pisces, which really in a lower note is about secrets, deception, illusion, all of these kinds of really helpful energies at the moment. And then if that wasn't enough, on Wednesday, we have the new moon in Cancer, which is conjunct Black Moon Lilith, who's also a very kind of strong energy. And then to cap it all on Friday, Mars is squaring Pluto, which is really, I think, as our friend Pam Gregory said, is the individual versus the government. So I kind of feel that when you with all of that energy in the upcoming week and these two very, very explosive decisions that have just happened this week, that it tends to point to the fact that there could be severe polarization about to happen in the US. So I'm sure a lot of our audience living in the US will know this perhaps better than we do. And I certainly don't want to get involved in any sort of conversations about which one is right or wrong, because I think we need to again go to a higher perspective and just see how this situation is unfolding from there, and perhaps why it needs to, and perhaps why America has this incredible opportunity right now, the United States of America that is, to reimagine itself as a new spiritual part of the planet rather than one that's been a colonizer. So I think this is a huge death and rebirth process for the nation that is currently the US. And I really feel very positive that a good outcome is going to come from this, as I do with everything. However, when I look at Europe, I see perhaps more like 1,500 to 2,000 years of karma that has to be worked through. And perhaps that's part of the soup that's being experienced. And that's perhaps why Mr. Johnson is doing his very, very best to point at every single corrupt thing that is going on in our country through participating in those activities himself. And, even if the recent by-election results are to be utterly believed, because of course a big piece that's coming out in the US is the decertification of the last election result, and that's probably going to bubble up this week. It seems that a number of states have decertified the election result, which means that it's been annulled. So Mr. Biden technically is not actually the president of the US, which I think is very interesting. So all of this is literally under the surface waiting to bubble up because it has to. And I think that our Mascot of Mayhem is doing his very, very best to show what a complete bunch of self-interested individuals are propping him up in government and refuse to let him go, primarily because if he goes, then probably they go and they lose their jobs. So I think that perhaps he's also trying to show us, like, it doesn't matter what he does, his party are going to keep supporting him because their own interests lie with him.
Well, of course, he did receive a very significant blow just within the last 24 hours, the resignation of his party chairman. I think that probably spells the end for Blojo, if I'm honest with you. I don't think he's going to survive that. It's just a question of how long he can spin it out, isn't it? But I was thinking when you were talking, it's also like the polarization, to go back to that topic for a moment, is also a bit like dialectic, in the sense that, movement occurs through a kind of synthesis that comes about as a result of opposites not being able to communicate or not being able to resolve certain things. So the old formula, which is, thesis meets antithesis, and that results eventually, sometimes painfully, in synthesis. I guess on a political sphere, I'm not aware of that ever having really worked I think it should work, but it certainly, as a political theorist yourself, you might be able to comment on that a little more knowledgeably than I.
Expand for me, bro, so that I can lend my expertise effectively to this debate.
Yeah.
Can you give me some more parameters there? So what you're trying to get at?
Yeah. I think to be honest with you, I think it's somewhere in philosophy that this is discussed. It might be Hegel. I'm not sure. I'm going to display my ignorance big time here. Yeah, in terms of, well, for example, take a look at what happened in the Soviet Union as a result of the Bolshevik Revolution. Which was kind of, you know, the new against the old and established, the Russian royal family, and the way that was swept away. But then a new oligarchy took place, at least if we believe what we're told. And it began to look very much like the old regime all over again. So what I mean by, you know, the ideal of thesis and antithesis generating a synthesis and something new that comes out and hopefully progressive in a proper way, progressive, not in terms of progress, material progress, but in ways that perhaps make people's lives a little bit more easy, a little bit more worth living, a little bit more facilitated, which is what politics is supposed to do. So, in other words, you know, the two-party system which exists in this country, in America, and in many, many places in the world, which is supposed to provide an opposition, which is supposed to provide, you know, a balance, a counterbalance to the things that people in power get up to, and perhaps prevent them from going too far in any excessive direction. Well, that clearly isn't working, the systems that we're looking at the moment. But the ideal behind it is what I was trying to get at, which is, I think, embedded in political theory somewhere, that the reason you have this counterbalance is that hopefully, in the end, what you arrive at is something that is a consensus. Maybe.
Yeah, so I mean, some interesting points. I mean, as a political student and graduate, we were taught very early on that really the machinations of government, it doesn't really matter what the coloration is, blue, red, yellow, green, whatever. It's the system of government, and that's what's hardwired into the matrix. And I kind of have played with that idea a lot over the years and observed that actually, even when we swapped a Conservative government in Britain for a Labour government, we ended up with a Labour government that was probably more Tory than a Tory government. And of course, Mr. Blair has been responsible for all kinds of atrocities as a liberal, free-thinking lefty, supposedly. And of course, even just looping back to the whole piece about why certain refugees are going to Rwanda. Well, a lot of those refugees are coming from Syria, which is a country that, despite the population deciding that we shouldn't attack, our government decided to attack. So, you know, there's lots of loops and karmic things going on here. But I do think that the situation we have now is very clearly showing all of us who want to look that we have a non-functioning democratic system, if indeed a democratic system was ever something that actually functioned at all in the first place. And there was an incredibly erudite series of debates that I heard from some of the guys on UK Column as an audio podcast, actually, back, I think, in the end of 2020, where they went into this and actually pulled apart democracy and whether it was even a good idea and whether it had ever actually worked. So I definitely would point our listeners who know the UK Column to check out those pieces, because they were super interesting. And they kind of made the point that almost hardwired into democracy is the fundamental idea that it won't actually work the way that it's meant to, and it's always going to get picked apart by some entrepreneurial beings who find a way to subvert it. So it seems that democracy is always prone to subversion. So I like what you're saying, which is really that, if I've got this right, that by pointing to all of these inadequacies in our political spectrum, whether it's in the UK, in Europe, or in the US, that perhaps we're being shown the inadequacies of that, and that perhaps this is the bit you're getting to, the synthesis is to come up with something different that works for us all in a different way.
Absolutely, and I think it's got to happen on a significantly higher level, if I can say that as well. It's going to demand that we all up our game. It can't happen at the level at which the majority of people on this planet are currently operating. Sadly. Yeah.
So again, we come back to 5D down, right? What
Yeah.
we're dealing with in the 3D is actually either a 5D manifestation or is a 4D manipulation. And I think that we've certainly got both of those going on in our world at the moment. And this kind of 5D perspective is what we'd like to start really bringing into the world of the plants, right? And we're going to use this last sort of 10, 15 minutes or so of today's show to again loop back to some plants that have been catching our attention. And I know that we've got a few that we have mentioned before, but I think we're going to start a little bit again with the heavy metal aspect, because this is something a lot of people have been emailing me about off the back of our chats here on Web of Wyrd, but also my recent interview with Rebecca O'Reilly, and also some of my recent interviews with Pam, where we've been talking about the heavy metal toxification, which, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, is probably, certainly in my opinion, contributing heavily to the sense of toxic energies in our environments that I think are making people sick and leading them to believe that they've contracted something, which is part of a narrative that's been offered to them. When in actual fact, really what we're dealing with is a huge amount of heavy metal toxicity. So what can you tell us about plants that typically would be good for reducing heavy metal in the body, bro?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because a lot of things are being pushed at us at the moment from sources I'm not exactly sure where they're coming from, but common ideas like cilantro or coriander that came into the picture, and I was kind of interested in that. I worked with it a bit, and I don't know, I couldn't really say with my hand on my heart that I found that it was particularly helpful. I am a practitioner who was trained a long time ago in a school that emphasized heavy duty detoxification. And I was always taught that you use the really powerful alteratives, as we call them. And that means things like dandelion, burdock, rhubarb root, red clover. This is kind of a typical, I would say, North American eclectic blood and lymph cleansing kind of approach. Really, there are other herbs that go in with that too. There's some powerful ones called like poke root and chaparral, for example. And there are several examples of these formulae out there, and they are kind of quite complex formulae used by various people. Eli Jones, for example, Harry Hoxsey, not to mention Dr. Christopher, my own teacher, Dr. Richard Schultz, as hardcore detox formulae or recipes, and they were always also decoctions, so they were not simply putting things in capsules or cups of tea or whatever. They were boiled, that the hell was boiled out of them before you would take them, and you would have cathartic reactions from them in many ways as well. And it's kind of an old school way to do things. I was always told that these were super effective at dealing with heavy metals. And what I have to say, having worked with a formula that I kind of got from that channel, and we've made a few of our own changes and additions to it along the way, that when I work with that formula, it is incredible what it can do in terms of what we were saying earlier about just removing things that don't need to be there and watching the vitality flow back. This is a formula, we call it actually just detox tea, and it is kind of our formula, but it is an old school formula as well, because it is based on those ideas. That's the school that we particularly studied in. So I've never really, I cottoned on to coriander, and people talk about chlorella. I think that can be useful as well. But I've never moved away from that position of these herbs, like they're dredgers. That's what they do. They dredge the liver, they dredge the blood, they dredge the lymph, and they get out stuff that doesn't want to be there. And they have all sorts of other immunomodulatory activities as well. They're desmutagenic, which means that they neutralize toxins that could cause cell damage. There's 101 different kind of actions from these plants, and you put them together in a formula that also is designed to activate certain key metabolic processes like digestion, for example, because digestion, if you go along with traditional medicine, Ayurveda, for example, and also TCM, but also our own Greco-Roman energetic tradition, it's lack of the fire of digestion which produces a lot of toxins within us as well, because it can't transform the foods. And if the foods themselves are toxic, they're also containing contaminants, then you're basically creating toxins inside you through not being able to digest things properly as well. So bonding those two principles together which if you like are the sort of nutritive side of things, to make sure that that your vitality is sufficient. In Chinese medicine, it would be called spleen qi. Spleen qi deficiency being a huge cause of downline toxicity, phlegm, for example. All those people in China at the beginning of the pandemic who developed this awful suffocating mucus in their chest. Largely that was to do with the amount of phlegm that they were already carrying because of the situation they were living in and their diet and so on and so forth. But interestingly, in that situation, some of the herbs that I've just mentioned were coming forward and being able to break that down, break it up, move it out of the system. Rhubarb root came forward very strongly at that point. Rhubarb root's a fantastic herb, actually. We must get into that at some time. From this point of view, it breaks down mucus deposits, it moves the bowels, it's a liver dredger. So actually quite pleasant herb to take as well. It tastes quite nice. This is my, as you kind of got a lot to say about this, this is my tradition, detoxification, and then using foods as detox too, things like lemons, garlic, ginger. Ginger does things, garlic and ginger do things in the liver that are really, really super interesting in terms of how they modulate the detox channels, the enzyme pathways in the liver. So I've been working with this for a long, long time. And people say sometimes, well, I get that detox is all very well, but what about specifically heavy metals? Do I need something special for heavy metals? And I can't see that you do. I can't see that these herbs are not going to shift that in the same way as they shift everything else. So that's my take on it. And that assertion comes from long years of using those herbs for this purpose. And anybody with any kind of situation that we've been talking about Lyme disease, we've been talking about Epstein-Barr, long-term chronic situations where these viruses or whatever they are, these ideas, these entities are seemingly active. I've seen them disappear with this approach.
Wow, thank you, bro. Yeah, so much to chew on there. And, I hope in episodes to come, we're obviously going to continue to talk a lot more about other plants. And I welcome the opportunity to meet rhubarb root, because that's not someone that I know particularly well. But it's interesting what you're saying. A plant that I just want to quickly bring in, I've mentioned before, is Herb Robert. Not particularly well known in many circles for its medicinal properties, but is often a plant that people find themselves arriving at after they've been through chemotherapy, which, when it hasn't worked, needing to remove the sort of the heavy metal effects of that. And I find it interesting that where I lived in Wales before was a heavily mined area. So there'd been a lot of exposure of metals in the earth being brought to the surface, and the Herb Robert grew everywhere, all over that area. We even had an ironworks down in the valley in Clydach, where I used to live. And the Herb Robert grew everywhere. And so I started investigating the Herb Robert in conjunction with wormwood, and was told by those two plants that in combination they could actually cure cancer. And at first I couldn't work that one out until I realized, well, wormwood has the ability to remove the veil, so you can see like the root origin of a trauma. But then, actually the effects of the cancer in the body can actually be removed by Herb Robert, actually from the body, but it requires the dual aspect of realization of what caused it and then the release. And Herb Robert's considered, I think, to be a carrier of certain heavy metals out of the body. So I find that interesting, and that these plants grow everywhere around us. And I think that's also nice way of leading into our next piece about adaptogens and wild oat, as opposed to maybe ashwagandha or one of these more fancy overseas adaptogens.
Yeah, and that was something I brought to the table, as you know, a week or so back when I encountered wild oat in the Cambridge University Botanic Garden. I was there doing some filming for of a YouTube channel that our college are launching, and I had to really look around the garden and find herbs that would be useful in treating stress, anxiety, and that kind of thing. And I won't go into the details of all the other herbs I found, but I found wild oat, and it seemed to call me particularly. It was immediately, I never really noticed the plant before, but it was there. It was like, look at me. I am what you want. And two things struck me about it. First of all, I was super excited to note that because wild oat has two phases, or there are two parts of the plant that we use. One is the young, fresh tops before they've really gone to seed, and they're sometimes called oat straw, or oat tops, or milky oats, because if you know what you're doing, there's a 4 or 5 day window in which to harvest this part of the oat plant, and it's when the seed literally contains, if you squeeze what looks like a seed head, it will ooze oat milk, basically, a milky substance. When we also put that together with the fact that the plant is very much associated with male sexual energy, you can draw your own conclusions from that as well. Sure. But I found the plant, and it was at this stage, which was just extraordinary because I'd never actually seen it before. And then, having sort of got the plant into my awareness, I mentioned last time we talked, I think on the last web of Wyrd, that I was going down the motorway, and the M11, at the bottom end of the M11, there's just mugwort all down the central reservation. And I was kind of going down again last week, and I saw a patch of wild oat in the same location, again in the central reservation down the southern end of the M11. And it just waved at me. And then I saw a whole bank of it a little bit further down. So it's something that's really strongly come into my own awareness. And for quite a while now, I've been interested in wild oat as a local alternative to a very popular adaptogenic herb that a lot of people now are interested in, and they're taking. Sometimes when people come and see me, they're already taking, because it has such a reputation, and that's ashwagandha. Again, very much associated with male sexuality. Its name means the smell of a horse, that idea of the strength and power of the stallion coming in there. But we have that in wild oat. And similar connotations, sowing your wild oats is very much an idea that kind of accords with the energy of wild oat. Not to say that wild oat is profligate in any way. I don't think it is. I think it's a super if anything, it teaches conservation of energy, and that's what an adaptogen really does. It says, right, stop losing all that energy. You've got it, develop it, store it. The idea in Ayurveda, for example, of the ojas, that sort of very fine level of fluid, takes 30 days to build it out of your diet and out of herbs that you might take. But it's behind everything. It's a manifestation, if you like, of vitality and strength and puissance, to use a French word there, power. Which can sort of perform miracles for us on all sorts of different levels. And I see that in wild oat. It's got, if you look at it chemically, it's got very similar properties. It's got the sterols in it. It's got the stuff that we can make our own hormones out of. It's got really, really powerful for modulating the neuroendocrine axis, particularly. It's good for hypothyroidism, it's good for sexual dysfunction, it's good for the adrenals, it's good for the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. Is a bit of a
I'm glad you said that, bro, because I think that could come out completely wrong if I tried to get my tongue around that one.
So everything, it was almost like it was saying to me, okay, so ashwagandha can do that, I can match that. Ashwagandha can do that, yeah, I can do that. And I now use wild oat quite freely as a substitute. And the other part of the plant that gets used, of course, is the seed itself. We are talking wild oat here, not porridge oats. Clearly they are related, but porridge oats have been bred for their nutritive value. Wild oats are still kept as the kind of the pure medicinal plant, Avena sativa, sativa meaning pure, really. And the seed is, again, ashwagandha is a nutritive tonic. And again, we couldn't find a better one for the adrenals, particularly, and for the nerve system. It has all the equipment, if you like, to nourish and strengthen the nerves and also the adrenals. So, yeah, I mean, I think we're looking at a situation in the world where we may lose access to things that, come in from the outside. I've always had this in mind as a herbalist. Traditional herbalists, if they know what's good for them, always look in their local environment for the stuff they need. If you rely on ashwagandha, you can grow ashwagandha here, by the way. It does grow quite easily. It's very difficult to grow it in a way that will deliver its medicinal value in the way that it does if it's grown in Sri Lanka particularly, or somewhere like that. You can grow it. I've made friends with that plant itself. I do love it actually, but wild plants will always give more when it comes to medicinal properties, because they've had to survive. The definition of adaptogen is that it's through its own act of survival, it imparts that strength to us as well. So yeah. And the other thing that struck me about wild oat, just a couple of seconds longer here, is that it's a very delicate plant. And when you consider that it's actually associated with endurance and strength and stamina, it's extraordinary how slender and delicate it appears. And it reminds me of that whole thing about, what's better? Is it better to be a stout post in a hurricane, or a reed that just simply flattens itself and waits for the whole thing to blow over? There's some wisdom there, I think.
Yeah, thank you, bro. I feel there's a lot more to unpack with wild oat, but also just to remind everybody that we have another amazing adaptogen that grows super easily in our environment, which is, of course, our favorite Mr. Nettle. So I kind of completely concur with you on the level. We've often been taught as herbalists that what grows around us is already connected to the bioflora in our gut, and so the environment around us is actually producing the plants that we need. And I had an interesting conversation with a friend yesterday who is very much in need of a plant to heavy metal detox, who told me about a house that they just moved into where the landlord had been using Roundup on the garden like nothing was growing. But shortly after they moved in, suddenly our very favorite plant, Horsetail, started growing en masse in the garden, and has completely swamped the garden, and nothing else can grow. So I think that's also interesting in the sense of what you were saying before about your experience with Horsetail. And Horsetail, what was the mantra again that Horsetail gave you?
Horsetail, yeah, the message I got from Horsetail was, I become what I want to destroy.
Right. So, thinking about the context of the Roundup and the ability for Horsetail to transmute those unhelpful frequencies or energies is perhaps showing us that it can do the same thing in our body. And if we've become overly toxified with similar substances from wherever, then perhaps Horsetail can help us with this. And so again, I really think that in the time to come, and you mentioned Brexit, of course, which has kind of given lots of, whether real or imagined, shortages on the shelves, and that's something we've talked about before. But this kind of idea of becoming more local, I think, is super important, because actually, what makes ashwagandha more exotic and sexy than nettle? Yeah. The fact that it comes from Sri Lanka, is that it? Or that it's got a fancy name that we can't really get our tongue around so easily? What's the difference between ashwagandha, wild oat, and nettle, dude?
Indeed. And I said to you, I confided in you earlier, and now I'm confiding in several hundred, if not thousands of people. But sometimes I think that a plant, or pretty much any plant you choose, if you talk to it nicely, will do what you want. And I think that we're seeing this a lot I'm seeing a lot in my practice at the moment. There are some shortages that happen. It's nothing new, not to do with Brexit or anything like that. It's been happening for as long as I've been in business. You're relying on things that we get from the earth. Transportation comes into it, logistics, etc. It doesn't always work the way you want. So we run out of things. And the skill of a good herbalist is to be able to put a substitute in. Okay, so I can't use that, so I'll use that. That's how I got onto wild oat versus ashwagandha, because I was putting ashwagandha and everything, and then suddenly it occurred to me I didn't have to do that. And what I've been finding is that actually a lot of plants are coming forward and saying, it's okay, I'll do that, and I'm like, oh, okay, fine. And that's super exciting, because that means you don't even have to work with a huge repertoire. I mean, I have 120 herbs in my dispensary, probably more.
Now you're just showing off, bro.
I built up over a long period of time, but
I'm getting apothecary envy here, bro.
I love them all. I love them all, obviously. But if we were reduced to things that we could grow, I mean, I'm quite keen on this idea actually of maybe growing more and making things that are kind of that I look after from that point of germination through to finished medicine. I'm really keen on. I know you've done that, so you're well up for that. I mean, I've been focusing on education and other things, really, I guess, and I'm sort of wanting to come a bit more down to earth these days. But I actually wanted to just loop back to Horsetail, because I had a Horsetail story come in today.
Yeah,
an old friend and client of mine from maybe 20 years or so ago He was he was in his mid-60s when I first knew him. He's now 84. Who his wife, who was a good friend of mine, told me he had prostate cancer a year ago, and they were very worried about him. His PSA was really high. His cancer markers were really high. PSA was up at 1165, so 1165, very high indeed. Should be below 2 or 4 or something like that. And then cancer markers, bone cancer, 777. So I got him onto Horsetail. She phoned me up and she said, "What should I do? You know, we're really worried about this." And Horsetail just came into my head. And I said, "Look, I remember where they live. They don't live there anymore." But I said, "You've got the answer at the back of your house. Yeah, house backs onto a canal in Cheshire." And I said, "Horsetail, just go and get it, dry it, harvest it, dry it, and you make sure he gets a good couple of cups of Horsetail tea every day." And because Horsetail is a herb that we give for the prostate anyway, you know, it is a 5-alpha reductase inhibitor. As we say, it stops the conversion of testosterone into dihydrotestosterone, so it kind of modulates that whole hormonal cycle that is involved with prostate cancer. So I gave him that as an infusion, as a herbal infusion. A year later, his PSA is down to 1. His CA is down to 94. He's still got it. He's still got bone cancer, but he's in, and his doctors are looking at him in absolute amazement, because they're saying, you know, they tested his blood and they're saying this is the blood of a 20-year-old. Wow. So amazing result there. I'm really, really pleased for him. Nice guy too.
Great story. Thanks, Brian. I think, again, that just kind of re-emphasizes what we've been saying all the way through this episode, and what we tried to say through all of our podcasts, I think, which is really that anything is possible, right? And particularly now we're moving into a quantum space. And I know that you're getting a lot more of the quantum downloads from the plants too, as indeed are many people I know right now. I'm really feeling a huge level of increase in sensitivity to plant information that is perhaps coming from a more quantum space. And I'm hearing that being reflected back to me from clients and students and friends who work with plants. And I think that's really, really exciting. And again, just to reiterate, I'm going to be doing this talk this week with Zach, which will be available on my new website, quantumplанthealing.com. Again, it'll be in the show notes. And we're really going to be exploring this idea, because both myself and Zachariah believe very strongly that this is the future of healthcare, bringing it back to ourselves, working at the quantum level with plants, talking to them at that level, getting the intuitions, and then going into the field, working with them, and then seeing the incredible results like you've just shared with me. And I know you've shared other stories about dandelion and all kinds of other things. So I hope that perhaps we might do some more dedicated shows actually in the time to come around certain plants, because certainly what I'm going to be doing very soon is focusing on a bunch of plants that I believe are going to help a lot of us clean our bodies up and help us shift into the more sort of 5D space. And Horsetail is very much part of that. Dandelion, the Artemisias, and a few other plants like fireweed maybe in San Pedro are going to be plants that we're talking about on the call. So I hope our audience will tune in for that, because that's also going to then kickstart some other pieces I'm going to be doing with other friends, and also an online global dandelion diet, which I'm hoping your good self is going to be involved in, Pete. Some more details about that. Yeah,
can't wait.
I know. Yeah. So these are the plants that we're sharing right now to all of our audience out there, because we think they're important. We are very much on a mission, myself and Pete and quite a few other people working with plants, because we realized, as we've been talking about throughout this show, that there is a huge level of toxicity now in pretty much every environment in the inhabited parts of the world that needs to be addressed, because I do believe it's what's actually making people sick. And the more that increases, the more it increases. It's not sort of, you know, coming and going, it's just getting more and more. And so I feel like we need to start taking some serious steps. And many of you out there have already emailed me and said you've been working with dandelion or the Artemisias already intuitively, and even Horsetail. You know, it's amazing how often we mention a plant, and then suddenly I get a deluge of, you know, comments and emails from people saying, "Hey, I just literally started working with this plant because it called me." I'm like, there we go, it's already in the collective, which plants we need. And I think that this is the beauty of quantum plant intelligence, is it's already with us. We just have to kind of access and then go, oh my gosh, there it is. And often it happens intuitively, right?
Absolutely. That's really that's fantastic that you're getting big people who are actually on the same track emailing in. That's brilliant. That blows me away, and it reinforces the importance of this, really. To act as a hub for this kind of information is vital, I think. So anyway, big up, bro, for getting it started, and yeah, I'm super happy to be here. So
great. Well, thank you, brother. This has been a little bit of a longer show today. We kind of got super excited to think about a few topics and went into them a bit deeper, but hopefully that's okay with our audience, because I think there was some really juicy and useful stuff there. And yeah, you know, again, I just want to say to all of our audience, please do feel free to email either myself or Pete, or put comments in the box, or if there are topics you'd like us to discuss. You know, this is very much a sort of an organic podcast where we talk about the things that are going on or have come to us in the week or in between the shows, and we try to pick them apart from a more 5D perspective and show ways to or you know, have solutions to some of the things that we're perceiving. So I really hope that everyone out there is finding it useful and inspirational, and please do share your plant stories with us too, because there are some plants that maybe we don't know about that some of you are having experiences with and would like to share. You know, that we really, I think, both believe strongly that the way forwards is through collective sharing and that idea of community, and that can mean many different things, including a global quantum plant community, which is something that I'm very much in favor of. So on that upbeat note, I'd like to thank you again, Pete, for all of your time this week, mate. As always, super interesting, and appreciate your thoughts. You got anything you'd like to say before you go?
not really. I think we've said it all, bro. Just
a lot.
just keep listening to the plants.
Booyaka. Well, I second that, and I look forward to catching up again in a couple of weeks. And please do check out the show notes to find out more information about my website and Pete's and other things going on. And look forward to seeing you all for another episode of Web of Wyrd very soon. Take care, everybody. Have fun and enjoy your weekend. Ciao for now.